The wealthy father returned from his business trip and froze in shock at the scene before him. His little daughter, dressed in a tattered, dirty pink dress, was holding her 8-month-old baby brother in her arms. Her voice was breaking with sobs as she pleaded, "Please, don't hurt me and my brother anymore." From that precise moment, every secret hidden within the house began to unravel. James Peterson sat in his cold office. At 43, he was the owner and director of the top floor of the Summit Tower on Park Avenue, one of the most luxurious buildings in the heart of New York City. On his desk rested a gold-plated pen and a thick stack of files. He signed each page like a machine, the light from the crystal chandelier reflecting off the Rolex on his wrist. The custom-tailored suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly. Italian leather shoes gleamed under the desk. Everything around him spoke of wealth, success, and power, the very things any man might dream of. But inside, his heart was empty. James had once known family happiness. Sophia, his first wife, had been the light of his life. Emily, his first daughter, used to run through the garden, her soft brown hair waving in the wind. And now there was Matthew, the baby, only 8 months old, born in the midst of loss. The day Sophia left this world due to a postpartum hemorrhage, James felt as if his own life had vanished. 8 months had passed, and not once had he sat down to play with Emily, nor had he held Matthew in his arms. He took refuge in business trips, paperwork, and numbers, as if running from his memories. During that time, Veronica, his second wife, appeared like an angel. A close friend of Sophia's, she had entered the house with a gentle presence, soothing everything that was broken with her sweet, radiant smile. For James, she was the devoted woman he needed. If Sophia had been the light, Veronica was the salvation of his life. She held both children as if they were her own, caring for them with the tenderness of a model mother. Seeing that, James felt at ease. He thought, at least the children have a woman in the house. It's better than growing up with just a cold father. He was always grateful to her for shouldering the weight he had abandoned. Today, after a month-long business trip, James closed the last file. He stood up and saw his reflection in the large mirror on the wall. His face was stern, his eyes tired. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind. He wanted to go home early without telling anyone. He wanted to bring them a little surprise. Maybe Emily would run into his arms. Maybe Matthew would smile when he held him. Those thoughts softened him for the first time in months. James grabbed his coat and left quickly before his secretary could ask another question. The luxury sedan glided down the highway leading to his estate in Westchester County. That house, once filled with laughter and warm with life. Now it was a place James barely set foot in, stopping only between trips. Today, it felt different. He wanted to see his family. The iron gates swung open, and James stepped into the grand foyer. Everything was unusually still. The golden glow of the chandelier fell on the marble floor. He set his briefcase on the table and took off his coat. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, he heard the faint sound of a child's sobs. Matthew. The sound cut through the silence. James froze. Amidst the weak cries, another voice followed, trembling, small and broken. "Please, don't hurt me and my brother any more." James's body tensed. It was Emily, his daughter's voice, choked, pleading. His whole body contracted. His heart seemed to stop. He moved slowly down the hall and stopped just out of sight, behind the door frame leading to the living room. The scene he witnessed made it hard for him to breathe. 6-year-old Emily, her brown hair tangled and her pink dress stained with dirt, was huddled on the floor, her small arms wrapped tightly around Matthew. The baby's face was red. His cries were incessant. His tiny hands reached out, clinging to his sister. Emily bowed her head. Her shoulders trembled. Standing over them was Veronica. She wore a tight red dress. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her face heavily made up. But her voice was nothing like the sweetness she showed James. It was sharp, every word cut like glass. "Shut up! How many times have I told you? Don't bother me. If you don't obey, I'll throw you both out on the street again." James lunged forward, stepping between Veronica and the children. "Stop!" His voice was hoarse but firm. He reached out, trying to take Matthew. His movements were clumsy after so long without holding his son. "Let me take him. Emily, come here to Daddy." The little girl froze. Her fingers clutched the hem of her dress. James hesitated for a moment. His hand hovered in the air before he pulled it back. He stood instinctively in front of them, shielding them. A flash of venom crossed Veronica's eyes, sharp as a needle. In an instant, it vanished behind a gentle smile. "You're back?" "I was just teaching the children some discipline. They were being too rowdy." She moved closer, placing a light hand on the sleeve of James's jacket. Her voice softened. "Honey, you must be tired after coming home. Don't get upset over a moment of childish crying." The doctor said, "Children need discipline, don't they? I've been with them all month. I understand their behavior best." James held Matthew tightly, feeling a burn in his throat. He looked at Emily. He saw the panic in her eyes. And then again at Veronica's tender smile. She tilted her head, pursing her lips as if in pity. "Or maybe you just feel guilty for being away too long, so everything seems worse than it is. Don't overwhelm yourself. Children pick up on the adults around them." The words slid out, smooth as a breeze, but sharp as a blade. James looked down, swallowing hard. He spoke slowly, struggling to stay calm. "I don't want to hear crying like that in this house." Veronica seized the words, turning them into her excuse. "Exactly. That's why I'll handle it in the gentlest way. Go take a shower, change, get comfortable. Don't let the children see us disagreeing. It's not good for their minds." As she finished, she shot a sideways glance at Emily. A single, slight smile was enough to make the little girl bow her head. A snake hidden under velvet. And James saw it, though he couldn't name it in time. He stood there, frozen, half anger, half guilt, tangled in a knot inside him. A painful, nagging question echoed in his mind. What did I just witness? James took a deep breath. He adjusted the baby in his arms so he wouldn't slip, and he walked into the living room as if everything were still normal. Veronica had already put on a gentle expression. Her voice was warm but clearly forced. "You came home early. You surprised me. I'll tell the kitchen to prepare dinner. Sit down and rest. I'll take care of the rest." James nodded. He looked at Matthew, who was still sniffling, and his chest tightened with the feeling that he had missed something profoundly important over the last 8 months. Veronica snapped her fingers lightly, and the housekeeper appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Mrs. Davis, an older woman who had worked for the family since the days Sophia was alive. She was discreet, well-mannered, and spoke little. She gave a soft nod to James and then went back inside to set the table. Dinner was served quickly. The yellow light reflected off the silver cutlery. The aroma of chicken soup rose warmly, but it couldn't dispel the chill inside James. He sat at the head of the table with Veronica to his right. Emily was across from him, and Matthew in a small high chair, his eyes still wet and restless. "Eat, sweetie, so you can grow up strong," Veronica said as she placed a piece of meat on Emily's plate. Her voice was sweet as honey. Her smile was fixed in place, but the hand she rested on the girl's shoulder pressed down just a little too firmly. James saw Emily's small shoulders flinch and the spoon in her hand tremble. He leaned forward slightly, watching more closely. On Emily's left wrist were faint purple marks that looked like fading bruises. James's heart pounded, and he heard his own voice rise, slow and heavy. "Emily, has anyone at school been bothering you?" The little girl started. Her eyes flashed with fear before she quickly looked down. Her voice was barely a whisper. "No, no, Father." Veronica let out a soft laugh and turned to James. "Children get bumped around when they play. I'm always reminding her to be careful." James remained silent, turning the spoon in his hand. A wave of guilt washed over his back, knowing that for months he hadn't been there to notice these small things. Suddenly, Matthew kicked. His lips turned down and a whimper grew into a long cry. Veronica stood up, walking over to pick him up. Her hands slipped under his arms, but she gripped him too tightly. The movement was quick, but without tenderness, and Matthew screamed louder, his face turning red. "Give him to me. James shot up, holding out his arms, his voice urgent. Veronica glanced at him briefly and then handed the baby over. James caught him awkwardly, his arms stiff as wood after so long without holding his son. Emily raised her head, her eyes filled with surprise and hope. James adjusted his grip, pulling the baby close, rocking him gently. Matthew kept crying, but his sobs became less sharp, and James's own breathing slowed with each firm pat on the baby's back. "You're safe now. Daddy's here," James whispered. The words came out of his mouth, and he suddenly realized how long it had been since he'd last said something like that. The dinner dragged on slowly. Veronica kept starting conversations to fill the silence, mentioning a new investment portfolio, asking James about his business trip, sometimes turning to Emily with a half-hearted question as if to prove she cared. Mrs. Davis stood quietly in a corner of the room, her hands folded. She didn't interrupt once, but when James met her gaze, he saw an unease in her eyes she couldn't hide. He was about to call out to her, but Veronica had already offered dessert, leaving his question trapped in his chest. When the meal was over, James set his napkin on the table and spoke calmly. "I'm going to go upstairs to change and look over some documents. Emily, make sure you brush your teeth after you finish eating." "Yes, Daddy." Emily's reply was weak. Her eyes flickered quickly before they went dull again. James pushed his chair back, lifted Matthew, and handed the baby to Veronica. This time he noticed her hand more closely, her thumb pressing into the baby's side with a practiced reflex. James tightened his lips and said nothing. He turned and walked toward the stairs, the wooden steps creaking softly under his feet. On the fourth step, he stopped dead. He had heard the faint clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair, and then Veronica's voice dropped low, sharp as a blade cutting through silk. "Listen to me carefully. You remember what I tell you. If you dare open your mouth to your father, I'll throw you and your brother out on the street. I swear it." There was a pause followed by the sound of a quick, shallow breath, surely Emily's. And then a choked whisper. "Please, please don't. I'll be quiet. I won't say a word." James stood frozen. His hand gripped the banister until his knuckles turned white. His heart was hammering against his ribs as if trying to break free. His mind replayed the images he had just seen. Veronica's shifting voice, sweet one moment, venomous the next. His daughter's terrified eyes, the bruises on her thin wrists. Matthew's cries in arms that were not his own. Downstairs, Veronica's tone shifted again. She let out a thin laugh and spoke louder, just enough for her words to drift up the stairwell. "Good. Finish your food, and then I'll get you dessert." James still didn't move. Sweat slicked his palms even as his body felt cold. He swallowed, but his throat remained dry as anger and guilt wrapped around him, squeezing until he could barely breathe. Mrs. Davis slipped out of the kitchen. Her shoes made almost no sound. She paused. Her eyes lifted briefly toward the stairs as if she knew someone was there, but she didn't dare look directly. She placed a folded towel on the bottom railing, a small, discreet gesture that felt like a message. James bit down hard on the inside of his cheek to steady himself. He knew he couldn't just walk away as if nothing had happened. Yet he also understood that a single outburst now might frighten those small, trembling hands even more. He tightened his grip on the banister, took a deep breath, and forced the crashing wave inside him to calm. And so he stood there, on that step, listening to the beat of his own heart, the faint clatter of a spoon against a bowl, and the rise of a new, unmistakable command within him, a vow he couldn't put off for another day. James's hand still clung to the banister. He drew a deep breath, let go. Then he returned to the dining table and spoke a brief phrase to end the dinner. After that, he went to the study. He closed the door and stood silently for a long time by the bookshelf. He didn't sleep that night. He just listened to the small footsteps of his children and the whispers that echoed down the hall like needles piercing the skin. When the sky turned pale, he splashed his face with cold water, adjusted his collar, and walked straight to the kitchen. Mrs. Davis was placing dishes on the wooden shelf. She was the old housekeeper who had lived in this house since Sophia was a young wife. She was quiet, meticulous, and always kept the proper boundaries. Hearing James's footsteps, she froze, her thin, dry hands still holding the cloth. "How were the children while I was away?" James asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes couldn't hide his exhaustion. She hesitated, looked down, then sighed. "Do you want the truth?" James nodded. "I only want the truth." She set down the cloth, speaking slowly so as not to stumble over her emotions. Some nights, Miss Veronica would make the little girl stay on the porch for a long time just for dropping a spoon. One night, I found her holding her little brother, sleeping in the storage room because their room was locked. Many times, Matthew was only given very thin milk. He would cry from hunger until he fell asleep. I tried to step in, but she told me I had no right to interfere in how she raised them. James felt his heart clench, the image of Sophia holding a bowl of oatmeal, lifting Emily into her high chair, smiling as she told her a bedtime story. It came back like a blade cutting through memory. He swallowed hard, keeping his voice even. "Did you hear her make any threats?" "Yes," her answer was soft, her eyes still on the cloth. "She said that if the girl ever told you, both children would be thrown out on the street. She also threatened to fire me if I ever spoke of it." "I'm truly sorry, sir. She is too cunning." James shook his head, resting a hand on the back of a chair to keep it from shaking. "It's not your fault. From now on, if anything happens, you will tell me directly, and if needed, would you be willing to testify?" She raised her eyes, and in them was a quiet resolve. "For the children, I am willing." That entire day, James moved through the rooms as if inspecting an unfinished project. He called his office, postponed all his meetings, excusing himself with family matters. He went into the children's room, opened the closet to check the blankets, examined the baby bottles, and took notes in a tight script. Every small trace was like an accusation. Veronica smiled at him gently, asking about his work, but James said little. He told her they would talk later and asked the kitchen to prepare a light dinner. He didn't want to cause a disturbance. He wanted to see clearly. The evening fell very slowly. In the study, James pushed aside the files, and the small portrait of Sophia was left in front of him. He placed his hand on the wooden surface. An apology got stuck in his throat. The desk lamp lit up the lines at the corners of his eyes. Outside in the hall, the wind whistled faintly through the crack in the door. Then there was the sound of hesitant footsteps, stopping at the threshold. The door opened slightly. Emily stood there, holding Matthew tightly as he dozed, her eyes swollen and red as if she had been crying for a long time. James rose quietly, afraid to break the fragile shell that enveloped his children. He took Matthew into his arms, feeling how light the boy's body was and how uneven his breathing was from exhaustion. The faint smell of watered-down milk clung to his collar. He motioned for Emily to sit, pulling a chair closer so they could be at eye level. But the little girl still sat on the edge, her back rigid, her eyes darting toward the door. "Daddy!" The small call was barely a wisp of breath. Then it faded. James nodded as if to say there was no need to force any more words. He patted Matthew's back in a steady rhythm, catching the faint gurgle from the baby's stomach. Emily pulled her sleeve down to cover her wrist, her fingertips brushing the frayed hem of her dress, her legs flinching sometimes when a distant sound stirred in the hall. The air in the room was thick with pauses, as if every sentence wanted to rise but then retreated again. James handed her a cup of warm water. Emily received it with both hands. She took a tiny sip, her eyes still fixed on the outline of the door frame, as if waiting for someone to enter. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions but held back, afraid that even one wrong word might make her retreat further. Instead, he chose a neutral phrase, light as placing a blanket over her shoulders. "Sit here where it's warm." The girl nodded, let out a short sigh, and then looked down. When her sleeve slid back, a purple mark appeared for a moment and then vanished like a fish diving into dark water. James saw it but pretended not to. His chest tightened with a partial understanding and the beginning of not yet having enough evidence to name the rest. Matthew drifted off to sleep, his small hand clutching James's collar as if it were the last anchor he had. James stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might wake the fragile fears that were trying to settle. "You're safe here." His voice was barely a whisper. Emily nodded faintly. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but then she fell silent. Outside, the wind snaked through the crack of the door in a thin line, making the key hook rattle. The little girl flinched, her hand curled back in a reflex born of long practice. James reached out and proceeded slightly. His chair creaked with the softest sound. He froze instantly, his hands suspended in the air. Then he drew it back as if pulling it away from a flame. The silence thickened with another layer. Inside his chest, a question tore loose. When did the distance between father and daughter become so wide? My own daughter? Is she afraid of even my hand? James crouched down, speaking slowly so she could hear him clearly. "Sleep here tonight. I'll be right beside you." Emily nodded, her hands clasped tightly together. James dimmed the light, closed his study door, and walked down the empty hallway. The silence of the night seemed to swallow every breath. He couldn't sleep. Images of Sophia and her warm smile rose, again and again, from the darkness. He opened the door to his late wife's old room. A faint fragrance still clung to the shawl, and he pulled out the small drawer where Sophia used to keep Emily's cards. A thin envelope slid from the edge of the drawer, caught against the wooden lip. On the front was the handwriting he knew so well. For James. He froze. His hand trembled as he opened the letter. The slanted script felt like Sophia's voice speaking to him. "Don't trust anyone too quickly. Trust your daughter's eyes. When she's afraid, she won't know how to lie." James sank to the floor. The paper trembled with his breath, his mind filled with the image of Emily holding her baby brother. Her dress was torn and dirty. Her eyes were wide with fear. Matthew had felt so light in his arms. His breath caught at the thought. A wave of pain washed over him, no longer a vague sense of guilt, but a sharp, stabbing ache of fatherly love that squeezed his chest. He pressed the letter to his chest. He closed his eyes as if hearing Sophia's voice guiding him word for word. "I'm sorry, Sophia. From now on, I will protect our children." He opened his eyes. He stood up. He took the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket as if sealing a vow. His hand brushed against the photo frame on the shelf. From that moment on, the decision became simple. He would become a father again, in the truest sense. He held the letter against his chest for a long time until the light in the hallway flickered faintly with the wind. When he finally stood up, he felt a retightened pull, drawing him forward. The next morning, James woke up early. He made coffee, listening to Mrs. Davis's footsteps in the kitchen. The faint clink of a spoon. Veronica appeared shortly after, neatly dressed, smiling as usual. "Did you sleep well? I'm taking Emily to her music class today. Let's have dinner early tonight." "No need for that. I have things to do at home. You go on with your schedule." He said nothing more. All day he remained quiet, as if smoothing out the last crease in a suit. Yet his eyes never left James's, Veronica's movements. In the mid-afternoon, she received a call, her voice lowered. "All right, 10 minutes in the backyard." James was on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He changed course, circling around the stone path, and stopped behind the row of poplar trees. The back lawn was still, with no wind. A stranger entered through the side gate, a man in his 30s, wearing a dark coat and a slim bag slung over his shoulder. Veronica approached him. Her smile was no longer the gentle one she wore inside the house. "Right on time, Carl." The man shook her hand quickly. "I only have 10 minutes. Are you sure about the authorization?" Veronica lowered her voice. "It's a large sum. I want to bring it in earlier. The trust is in Peterson's name. If the signature is transferred, I'll gain control." Carl glanced around. Then he pulled out a thin stack of papers. "I need more proof that you have the right. The marriage certificate is there, but the signature for the power of attorney for the family fund is still missing. Peterson is no fool." Veronica gave a cold smile. "Don't worry. He's busy playing the perfect father. As for the rest, I'll get it another way." Carl folded the papers. "No more than 2 weeks. After that, the plan will be more difficult." "Thanks." Veronica touched his hand with a familiar gesture. "Keep it secret for me." James stood behind the trees. His heart pounded. He had heard enough to understand where the blade was aimed. It wasn't just the screams in the kitchen, not just the threats on the stairs. This was a step over another line. Carl left through the side gate. Veronica lingered for a moment. She fixed her hair and then walked back into the house with a calm face. James still didn't move. He opened his phone. The black screen reflected his own face. 3 tasks lined up in his mind. Straight as lines drawn with a ruler. Protect the children, preserve the evidence, and call an old friend who knew the law. He went back inside, passing through the living room. Emily was stacking wooden blocks for Matthew, glancing occasionally toward the kitchen. Her eyes shifted to him, still with some caution, but there was a small flicker too. James stopped for a second, resting his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. "Are you here with me?" Emily nodded, her lips forming a barely audible word. "Yes." James walked on, his hand gripping Sophia's letter inside his jacket pocket. His heartbeat quickened, not with fear, but with a late awakening that was turning into action. He knew what he would have to face, and he understood something else, chilling in its simplicity. She's not just mistreating my children, she's also plotting for the inheritance. James tightened his grip on the letter in his pocket and walked straight into the living room. He stopped by the playmat, bent down to pick up a wooden block that had rolled away, and placed it in Emily's hand. His voice dropped to reassure her. "Stay here with Daddy." Emily gave a slight nod, her eyes darting toward the kitchen as if checking if someone was listening. That evening, James stayed in the living room longer than usual. He sat beside her, opened a children's book that Sophia used to read to Emily years ago, and read slowly, letting each word linger. His other hand kept a steady rhythm on Matthew's back until the baby's breathing grew quiet and even. Whenever footsteps passed, Emily tensed. Her small hand gripped the hem of her dress. Her gaze would drift to the window as if looking for an escape. Seeing this, James whispered, "It's all right. Daddy's here." Veronica passed by once. She smiled faintly and asked as if in passing, "It's late. Let me take the children to their room. They have school tomorrow." James looked up, his tone deliberately calm. "I'll do it." Veronica shrugged and turned away, leaving behind a trail of perfume that couldn't mask the unease beneath her neat appearance. Mrs. Davis came with a glass of warm milk. She placed it on the table next to his chair. Her eyes glanced toward the door before meeting James's, as if reminding him not to lose sight of the children. James thanked her. He urged Emily to take a few sips. Then he placed Matthew in the portable crib, pulling it closer to his chair. He finished the page of the story in a steady, low voice. When the clock struck late, James carried Matthew and guided Emily toward the children's bedroom. The door was ajar, the room tidy but cold. He arranged the blankets, laid the baby in the crib, pulled a small chair for Emily to sit by the bed, and spoke slowly. "Daddy's right here. Go to sleep." Emily nodded, but before she closed her eyes, she still glanced outside as if waiting for some sound. James dimmed the hall light. He stood in the doorway a while longer. Then he returned to his study, deciding to move his chair closer to the door so that with a glance he could still see the faint light spilling from the children's room. Near midnight, James lifted his head from the stack of papers when he heard a faint metallic click at the end of the hall. He stood up quickly, following the sound, his heart racing before he could calm it. Someone had turned off the hall light, leaving the space blurred in shadow. James flipped the switch, and the sudden brightness made him squint. In front of the children's room, Emily was sitting hunched on the floor, holding Matthew tightly, the baby hastily wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes were red, her cheek pressed against her brother's forehead to keep him warm. The lock on the outside of the door clicked just as it released, and James understood at once. "Who left you out here?" James asked, his voice thick with anger, though he managed to restrain it. "She did." "She locked the room," Emily whispered. Each word caught in her throat as her arms tightened protectively around her brother. James knelt, gathered them both up, holding Matthew securely against his chest, while lifting Emily with his other arm. "Come with Daddy." He carried the children back to his room, pushed the door open until it caught in the frame, and closed it gently, moving slowly so as not to startle them. James laid Matthew in the middle of the bed, placed soft pillows around him, and pulled the blanket up to his chest. He slid a chair close for Emily by the edge of the bed, then poured the remaining warm milk into a small cup. "Drink a little before you sleep. You're tired now." Emily gripped the cup with both hands, her lips pressed tight to hold back a sob, her eyes fixed on her father's mouth as if waiting for a clear promise. James sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the blanket covering his daughter's legs. He didn't touch her skin for fear she would flinch, but he left the warmth of his hand there like an invisible thread connecting them. "I'm here tonight. You'll sleep in my room." Under the soft glow of the nightstand lamp, Emily looked up. Her gaze lingered on the face of the man who had only appeared in brief flashes over the past 8 months between work trips. Her voice trembled, breaking at the end of the sentence. "Daddy, are you going to leave us like my stepmother said?" James froze, his breath catching. The words, once so natural, were now gone. For a long moment, he could only pull the little girl closer and hold her against him. His chin rested on the crown of her head. The familiar scent of milk and childish sweat stung his eyes. He didn't know how to answer without it sounding late, without it sounding false. He only repeated the one thing he could be sure of. "I'm here." Emily gave a very slight nod, her small hand gripping the hem of his shirt as if clinging to a piece of driftwood. Matthew stirred, made a faint murmur, and fell back asleep. James stood still, listening to the two children's breaths mingling, the beat of his own heart slowing, and heavy as a silent promise being signed again in the dark. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps stopping just outside the bedroom door. James tensed instinctively. His arm tightened protectively around Emily's shoulders. Through the crack of the door came Veronica's voice, smooth as silk but cold as fine steel. "I think we need to talk, James." James gently squeezed Emily's shoulder to reassure her, then settled her on the bed and pulled the blanket up on Matthew. He stood up and opened the door, just enough for Veronica to see him. "The children are asleep. Whatever it is, we'll talk in the morning." Veronica smiled. She stepped back, her voice still soft. "As you wish." The door closed. James sat down in the chair, took out his phone, and dialed a familiar number. "Richard, come to my house tomorrow evening. There's something in the portfolio we need to discuss." On the other end, the man answered briefly. "All right." At 7 o'clock. Richard Monroe was a corporate lawyer in his 40s, discreet and direct. He had been with James since his first business ventures, understood how James thought, and could read details most people overlooked. He was not only skilled with contracts, but also had a deep knowledge of family trusts and asset protection, which was why James believed Richard's presence would be far more valuable than a polite dinner. The next evening, Veronica took charge of the kitchen. She chose a white tablecloth, arranged red roses, and set out gleaming silverware. When Richard arrived, Veronica went out to greet him with just the right smile, displaying the poise of a perfect hostess. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Monroe. Please, come in." Richard shook James's hand. His gaze swept the room before stopping in the corner where Emily was holding Matthew. He nodded to the children with a warm smile. Dinner began with soup. Veronica was attentive to every gesture in front of the guest. She placed the tenderest piece of meat on Emily's plate. She bent down to wipe a trace of milk from Matthew's lip and spoke with a honeyed sweetness. "Eat, sweetie, so you can grow up strong." Emily answered softly, "Yes, ma'am." Then she tried to lift a small spoonful. James glanced over. Over his daughter's shoulder, Veronica's hands seemed casually placed, but her fingers pressed down with just enough force to make the fragile muscle tense. Emily's face twitched. The spoon trembled. James maintained a calm expression as if he hadn't noticed, but a burning heat rose in his chest. Richard filled the silence with business talk. "I reviewed the update on the infrastructure fund. The allocation is leaning too heavily toward bonds. How long do you plan to maintain a defensive stance? James replied briefly while placing his hand on the table as a signal. I need to review the family trust structure. I'll have you look at it. Veronica's eyes flickered quickly. Then she smiled again. Mr. Monroe, you are always so thoughtful, always keeping family security in mind. When the main course was served, Richard turned to ask the chef about the sauce. He looked away for only a moment. Veronica leaned close to Emily's ear, her voice as thin as a razor blade. You remember this. If you whisper a single word, your little brother will pay the price. Emily froze. She put down her spoon, her gaze lowered. From that moment on, she ate no more. She sat silently with her hands tucked under the table to cover her wrist, still marked with old bruises. James noticed the movement. He raised his glass of water. He hit a long, steady breath and set it down firmly in its place, as if putting a small period on the decision he had just made. After dinner, Veronica served tea. I'll take the children upstairs first. She bent down, picked up Matthew, and smoothed Emily's hair in front of the guests. Come on, honey. Emily stood up. Before leaving, the little girl glanced at James for a second, her eyes expectant as if asking if it was safe. James gave a slight nod. Go ahead. I'll be up later. Only the two men were left in the living room. Richard put down his teacup, leaning back slightly in the chair. He talked a little more about the fund. Then he lowered his voice. You want me to review the trust structure, don't you? James replied briefly. Yes, and the power of attorney as well. Richard nodded. All right, but let me ask you this. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on James. From the moment I walked into this house, I saw a little girl flinch from a reflex of pain, a baby being held the wrong way, and a lady of the house controlling every glance. Did you call me about money or something else? James remained silent for a few seconds. He placed 2 fingers on the edge of the table to keep a rhythm. Then he spoke slowly. Both, but the latter matters more. Richard didn't rush. He took a small notebook from his briefcase and opened it to a blank page. Then let's start with the truth. Tell me what you've seen, what you've heard, and who you want to protect. James recounted in brief fragments without adding or omitting. The words on the stairs, the lock on the outside of the bedroom door, the bruises, and the threat just a moment ago. Richard jotted down a few keywords, never interrupting, just nodding when necessary. Veronica returned, smiling at the 2 men. Do you need anything else? Richard answered politely. Thank you. The tea was very good. She closed the door behind her. He waited a moment before continuing, his voice dropping even lower. My friend, I'm afraid your second wife is hiding a lot more than she lets on, and I can help you find out the truth. James looked directly at his friend. In his eyes, the burning anger had turned into a cold determination. Where do we begin? Richard left around 9 o'clock. James walked him to the door, kept his hand on the doorknob for a moment to steady his breath. Then he turned back to the house. He opened the children's bedroom door slightly. He saw Emily and Matthew already asleep. He pulled the blanket up to his daughter's shoulders and placed the teddy bear back by her side. Then he closed the door and went straight down to the living room. Veronica was pouring wine. The crystal glass cast a deep red reflection. I need to talk to you right now. James stood in front of her, his voice low and firm. Emily has a bruise. Explain it. Veronica set down the glass. The corner of her lips lifted. Are you accusing me? I spent the whole day here with the children. Did you see me cooking, bathing them, watching over them when they cried? She grabbed the glass again and slammed it down on the table. The stems snapped with a sharp sound. The wine splashed across the surface. I'll ask again. James didn't look away. What did you do to my daughter? Veronica let out a dry laugh. Do you really think I want to take care of Sophia's children? Don't you see it from the beginning? You never chose me. You only chose her shadow. James froze for a moment. He placed 2 fingers on the table to steady his rhythm. Stay on topic. Answer why the girl has a bruise. Children fall. Veronica crossed her arms. Besides, she is stubborn. She needs to learn to obey. I teach her like a mother teaches a child. A mother? James tilted his head. Are you talking about Sophia? She taught them by hugging and talking to them, not by locking doors and making threats. For a brief second, Veronica's face changed. Then it turned cold. She leaned forward, her voice cutting. Sophia, always perfect, kind, smart, everyone adored her. And me? I was nothing but her shadow. Did you marry me out of pity, or because Sophia asked you to before she died? James was silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of the truth settle. He spoke slowly, each word hitting with precision. I married you because I thought the children needed a woman in the house. I was wrong, and tonight I have corrected it. Veronica burst out laughing, her voice laced with resentment. Corrected? How? By kicking me out? Do you think the court will believe you? You were away for a month on business. Who took care of the children? I did. Who gave the baby his milk? I did. And where were you, hiding in your golden office? James didn't back down. You know why I called the lawyer tonight. You know what I saw, and you also know what I heard. Veronica slammed her hand on the table. Fine, then listen carefully. She spat out each word. Her eyes burned as if they were about to burst. I hate her, and I hate those two children who wear Sophia's face even more. Every time I look at them, I feel like I've lost. I stood by your side when you fell apart while she lay cold on a metal table, but you never looked at me as the one you chose. Never. James exhaled, long and pained. You're right about one thing. I didn't choose anyone. I just ran from the pain. But from tonight on, I choose to be with those children. I won't let anyone hurt them, not even you. Veronica tilted her head. Her smile stretched like a gash across her face. You think you can take everything back? You forget. I'm the legal wife. I have rights in this house, in this trust. If you want to fight, I'm ready. Tomorrow, James said, his voice flat and cold, I will meet with the lawyer about the trust and guardianship. I will also speak to the police about abuse if necessary. You should prepare yourself. You wouldn't dare, Veronica scoffed. You'll humiliate yourself in court. People will say James Peterson couldn't keep his wife, couldn't keep his house, couldn't keep his children. You can live with that. I can live with their words. James picked up the napkin and set it down neatly as if signing something in silence. What I can't live with is the sound of my children crying. Veronica faltered for half a second. Then she flared up again. Then you just wait and see who ends up being thrown out of this house. A soft creak of wood on the stairs made them both turn. On the landing, Emily stood, pressed against the railing, clutching her teddy bear. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. The small hand slid on the bear's fur, and the toy almost rolled down the stairs. Emily bent down to grab it, her hands shaking so much that even when she held it tightly, it still slipped. James took a step toward the stairs. His hand rose on instinct. Veronica's smile sharpened into something cruel. Neither of them said another word. The air froze around the ragged breaths of a little girl, trying not to cry. James managed to catch the teddy bear, put it back in Emily's hands, and whispered for her to go back to her room. He closed the door. He leaned against it for a few seconds to calm his breathing, and then he dialed Richard's number. We start the process tomorrow morning. On the other end, Richard gave only a brief reply. I'll see you in White Plains at 9 o'clock. The next morning, the hallway of the family court in White Plains smelled of paper and weak coffee. Richard Monroe walked beside James, holding a thick file that already included Mrs. Davis's statement and photos of the bruises. Emily clung to James's hand while Matthew had been left with a court-appointed caregiver outside the room. Veronica arrived with a man in a dark blue suit, her lawyer named Andrew Price. She wore light makeup, held a handkerchief, and her eyes glistened just enough in the right places. Case number 14, the clerk announced. Peterson's petition for the emergency protection of minors. The four of them entered. All rise. The bailiff's voice was firm. Judge Eleanor Miller sat above them. She was in her 50s with sharp eyes, a woman who spoke little but observed much. Richard began.
Your Honor, we are requesting an emergency protection order and contact restrictions for the respondent, Veronica Hayes, for emotional abuse and neglect. We have the housekeeper's testimony, photographs of injuries, and a letter from the plaintiff's late wife as context. Andrew lifted his chin, immediately interrupting. Your Honor, my client is a devoted stepmother. These accusations are speculation. There is no direct proof. Veronica dabbed the corner of her eye. The child is sensitive, Your Honor. I only disciplined her as any mother would. The judge nodded. Call the witness. Mrs. Davis took the stand, her hands folded. Richard asked concisely, What did you see? I saw the little girl repeatedly forced to stay outside on the porch. One night, she had to sleep in the storage room with her brother because their bedroom door was locked. The baby was often given only watered-down milk. I heard Mrs. Hayes threaten to throw them out if the girl told her father. Richard asked, Are you certain it was the respondent's voice? Yes, I was 6 feet away. Andrew approached, his tone flat. How old are you? 62. Could your memory have been mistaken in a dark hallway? No, her answer was short. I worked in that house for 10 years. I don't mistake her voice. Andrew raised an eyebrow. Do you have any personal grudge against my client? No, I only fear for the children. Richard presented a stack of photographs. Photographs of bruises on Emily's left wrist, taken 2 days ago, time-stamped. The judge examined them carefully, tilting her head slightly. Andrew quickly countered. Children run. They fall. Injuries are normal. The photos don't prove who caused them. Veronica lowered her face, sobbing at just the right rhythm. I did my best. He was away for months on business trips. Everything fell on me. James stood tall, his hands clasped to still their shaking. Richard moved on to the letter. This is a letter Mrs. Sophia Peterson left. It is not proof of behavior, but it provides context about the family and her instruction to protect the children. The letter was handed over. The judge read a portion of it, paused for a few seconds, then set it down. The court admits it. The courtroom was as tense as a drawn string. The judge looked from one side to the other. The court requires more direct evidence. Can the child speak? Richard looked at James as if asking for permission. James bent down, whispering to Emily, You don't have to say anything if you're scared. I'm right here. Emily looked at the high chair where the judge sat, then at her father's open hand waiting for her. She took a short breath. I want to talk. Emily took the witness stand. Her shoes tapped softly against the wooden edge. The clerk asked her name and age. My name is Emily Peterson. I'm 6 years old, Elena replied in a small voice. The judge gave a slight nod, her tone softening. You just need to tell the truth. Emily looked at her hands, then lifted her head, this time looking straight ahead. She said, If I told my daddy, she would throw me and my brother out on the street, but I can't be quiet anymore. I don't want my little brother to grow up scared. Her voice broke on the last word, but she didn't cry. From the bench below, James put a hand to his eyes. His breath escaped in a short sob. Richard set down his pen, not writing another word. The room fell silent. Judge Miller leaned back in her chair, her fingers laced together. She looked at Veronica, then at Andrew. She looked at James, and then back at Emily. Thank you, child. Andrew tried to recover. Your Honor, a child's words can be influenced. The judge held up her hand. That is enough. She turned to the clerk. Bring me the photographs again and summon the child protective officer waiting in the hall to enter after the session. Then she lowered her voice to Emily. Would you like to sit with the clerk for a little while? Emily nodded, stepped down, walked past James, and paused for half a second. James squeezed her hand gently. The air had barely begun to relax when Veronica's chair suddenly scraped back. She leaped to her feet, pointing toward the witness stand, her voice bursting out like a lid blown off.
Liar! You're just like your mother, always pretending to be so holy. Veronica's scream was still trembling in the courtroom when the bailiff stepped forward quickly, holding out a hand to stop her from advancing further. Judge Miller slammed the gavel 3 times, her voice sharp and decisive. Order! The respondent will be seated immediately. Veronica let out a harsh laugh, but her shoulders had gone rigid. Andrew tugged on her sleeve, whispering a few words in an attempt to put out the fire that had just erupted. Richard leaned forward to shield Emily from the sight. James placed the palm of his hand on his daughter's back, calming her with the softest touch. The judge reviewed the file one more time. Then she looked up. Based on the testimony, the photographs of injuries, the contextual letter coupled with threatening behavior directed at a minor, the court issues an emergency protection order. The respondent, Veronica Hayes, is suspended from all custody and visitation rights until a final judgment is rendered. Temporary custody is granted to the plaintiff, James Peterson. Furthermore, the court refers this case to the district attorney's office for investigation into child abuse and fraudulent conduct related to the family trust assets. At the clerk's prompt, Carla Evans, a social worker from the Department of Children's Services, entered the room. She was in her late 30s. Her voice was steady, a professional who had handled many similar cases before. She nodded to the judge and then addressed James. I will coordinate to ensure safety from this point forward. Emily clung even tighter to James's hand. He nodded, his eyes wet. The judge paused briefly, fixing her gaze directly on Veronica. The court also takes note of the respondent's insulting and threatening behavior toward a child within this courtroom. The respondent is held in contempt of court, and she is remanded into custody for 24 hours. Veronica's eyes went wide. Andrew stepped closer, his voice lowered in a desperate plea. But the bailiff had already motioned for him to follow procedure. The gavel fell a final time. This temporary hearing is adjourned. James crouched down and hugged Emily tightly. The little girl buried her face in his shoulder, the teddy bear wedged between her small arms. He wrapped another arm around Matthew as Carla brought the baby over, as if afraid that even the slightest gap might let the cold wind slip in. Tears streamed down his face before he could wipe them away. Richard placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, silently. Outside the courthouse, the hall erupted with the sound of camera shutters and urgent questions. A young reporter from the local station, Jenna Porter, held out her microphone. Mr. Peterson, is there anything you'd like to say to the public? Richard took half a step forward, raising his arm to shield them. Make way, please. We're protecting the children's privacy. James just bowed his head, holding Emily and Matthew close to his chest, carrying the 3 of them through the flood of lights, as if walking through a heavy rain. Behind them, Veronica was led through a different passageway, but when she saw James, she thrashed violently, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. You took everything from me, but you remember this, James. One day, you will pay for it. James paused for half a second. He didn't answer. He drew Emily closer, one hand steadying Matthew's back, his head bent slightly as if sheltering them under an invisible umbrella. The gesture itself spoke louder than any words. No one will ever touch them again. Richard leaned into James's ear and whispered, Go home immediately. I'll continue to work with the DA and Child Protective Services. There will be patrols around your house tonight. Carla nodded. I'll stop by to check on the home environment, mostly so Emily can see that the adults are on her side. As they walked toward the car, Jenna called out one last time, but her voice softened into a blessing. Good luck to the 3 of you. James turned his head and gave a slight nod. Emily clutched her teddy bear tightly. Her eyes watched out the window, her breathing now calmer. Night fell quickly over the courthouse parking lot. In the back corridor, the metal door clicked shut, sharp and dry. Veronica sat inside a small holding cell. The white light shone on a face pale with rage. Her hand gripped the bar so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The sound of the guard's boots faded away. The room was left with only her heavy breathing and the smell of cold steel. She lifted her head, staring into the darkness between the bars, whispering to herself as if swallowing the bitterness of her defeat. Sophia, in the end, you still win. But you just wait. I swear once I get out of this place, I won't leave your husband and your children alone. The steel door slammed shut behind Veronica. James put Helena's coat on and took Matthew from the social worker's arms. He signed the transfer papers with Carla Evans, listening as she gave him a few reminders about home visits and the children's therapy schedule. James nodded, thanked her, then carried Matthew to the car, holding Helena's hand as if the wind might blow her away. That night, he made milk, told stories, and soothed the children until they fell asleep. The next morning, he called Richard to start the long legal process. Life continued like this, one day after another, built on small but steady acts. 2 years later, the sky looked clearer. Helena had grown, her hair tied back, and her hand guided Matthew as he toddled along the brick path in the backyard. A small wooden sign hung from the fence painted with white letters, Mommy Sophia's Garden, tomato plants stretched up in green rows crowned with yellow flowers. Helena crouched down to show her brother how to rest his hand on the stem without breaking it. Her voice was bright with excitement. "Daddy, look at this! Matthew and I are growing tomatoes for you." James leaned back in the wooden chair, resting his notebook on his lap. He watched the children. He saw in Helena the figure of a big sister who knew she was loved and was learning to love in turn. Matthew stumbled forward, his small shoes smudged with dirt, his face lifted in a wide smile. James's lips curved into a soft smile. Inside, he whispered a line meant only for the one who was no longer there. "Sophia, I did it. I kept my promise." Carla Evans appeared at the back door with a folder in her hand. She was still assigned to the family's case, though now the visits were just routine. Carla smiled, waved, and said, "I brought the certificate, confirming the therapy program is complete. Helena is making great progress, and Matthew is developing normally." James stood up and shook her hand. "Thank you for everything." Carla nodded. "Thank you for staying." After Carla left, Helena ran over with a basket of seedlings. She plopped down on the bench next to James. "Daddy, can you help me with the stakes? I didn't tie them tight enough." James held the twine, carefully showing her as he explained. "Wrap it like this, tight enough to hold, but loose enough for the plant to breathe." Matthew hovered nearby, occasionally pressing a stone into his father's hand as if it were a gift. James pocketed each one, not missing a single piece. A while later, Helena put down the basket and rested her head on her father's shoulder. The scent of sun and soil clung to her hair, the truest perfume he had ever known. James remembered the first hearing when those small shoulders trembled with fear. Now they were steady. He asked quietly, "How's school going?" Helena smiled. "Rose asked me to be the team leader. I told her about the garden, and she loved the story." James nodded. "Tonight, I'll make pasta with the first ripe tomatoes. You'll be my assistant chef." Helena giggled. "Yes, Daddy." The back door opened, and Mrs. Davis brought out a plate of butter cookies, the scent clear in the air. She set it on the small table. Her eyes crinkled with joy as she looked at the two children. "Have some milk, children," she turned to James. "There's a letter from Lawyer Richard. He sent the schedule for the final hearing to confirm permanent custody." James took the paper, scanned it quickly, and felt as if a heavy stone had finally settled firmly in place. He said, "This afternoon, after your nap, we'll stop by Uncle Richard's office, and then we'll go for ice cream." Matthew's head shot up at the word ice cream. "Ice cream?" James picked him up, pretending to think. "What flavor will it be?" Matthew giggled. "Strawberry?" Helena chimed in. "I'll choose vanilla for you, Daddy, because you said vanilla goes best with Mrs. Davis's cookies." James glanced at the housekeeper, and the three of them burst out laughing. That afternoon, they stopped by Richard's office. The man shook each of their hands, patted Matthew on the head, and gave Helena a star-shaped paperclip. "It's done," he said simply. "The rest is just living well." On the way back, Helena held the paperclip like a treasure, occasionally holding it up to the window to let the sunlight shine through it. When they returned to the garden, the day was already fading. James washed his hands and went to the kitchen. Helena stood beside him rinsing tomatoes, while Matthew counted strands of pasta, laying them one by one on the table like pieces of a train track. James lit the stove, stirred garlic in the pan, and occasionally looked at his children, seeing in that image a steady rhythm of life he once thought he could never regain. When dinner was ready, Helena put her hands behind her back. She cleared her throat like a little announcer and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the chef proudly presents the Peterson family pasta with tomato sauce from Mommy Sophia's garden." Matthew clapped. James laughed heartily. "I invite our two distinguished guests to enjoy the meal." After dinner, Helena ran around the garden, then suddenly stopped, turned, and hugged him tightly. "Daddy, we're really a family now, right?" James lifted her onto a chair, wrapped his arms around her, and answered firmly, "Yes, and it will always be this way." Matthew hugged his legs, trying to squeeze into the family embrace. James gathered both children in his arms and leaned back in the chair. The night fell, but the garden stayed warm with their presence. The shadows of the three of them overlapped on the grass, forming a single solid figure. In the corner, the tomato stakes stood tall. The twine held them just right without choking them, the same way James had learned to hold his family together. He looked up at the wooden sign and brushed his fingertips over Sophia's name. In that quiet moment, James realized he was no longer afraid of courtrooms, flashing cameras, or empty threats. What he had now was the laughter of his children, their peaceful sleep, and the steady heartbeat of a real home. Those things were not loud, but they endured. Helena yawned and snuggled her head against his shoulder. Matthew fell asleep with a small green tomato still in his hand. James carried them both inside. He turned off the lights one by one, checked the locks, and paused once more at the children's room. He stood in the doorway, listening to their steady breathing. Then he stepped back and closed the door with a gentle touch. Outside, the night breeze brushed against the fence, carrying the scent of young tomato leaves. Inside, the photograph of Sophia on the shelf seemed like a silent blessing of peace. The story closes with the image of a father and his two children in a lush green garden with a simple but profound confirmation. When an adult chooses to stop and listen, a child can escape the shadows. That is the simple but powerful message. The wicked will be punished, the good will be rewarded, and justice must be built on truth, courage, and unconditional love. James wasn't perfect, but he returned at the right time, stood up to protect Emily and Matthew, and made amends through his actions every single day. We too can do the same for the children around us. What do you think of Emily's journey from silence to speaking up? What part moved you the most? The whispered words, "Please, don't hurt me and my brother." Sophia's letter, or the moment James said, "I'm here." If it were you, what would you do upon noticing the slightest sign of a child asking for help? Share your thoughts so we can converse together and spread the meaning of this story. I also want to ask how you are doing. Are you watching this from somewhere far away, late at night, or maybe in the middle of a busy day? If today has been draining, I hope this story brings you a moment of peace. Don't forget to drink some water, rest your eyes, and hug your loved ones if you can. If you believe in heartwarming, emotional stories that can lift people's spirits, please share this so someone else can find strength too. Would you like me to continue telling more journeys of healing or delve deeper into one of the characters from this story? Leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you for being here, for listening with your whole heart.